With Dan and Amy continues now, and make sure to stay tuned to catch me, Mike Gallagher, coming up at 9, only on AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy, and we're on the cusp of another special session in Illinois, this time over school funding. The last one, of course, a catastrophe with a massive tax increase, no spend reform. That was just 2 weeks ago. Now, Chicago Democrats want to effectively do the same thing, but under the guise of school funding. And also mandating how many teachers are hired, what their compensation is, all kinds of mandates in this 500-page. Yeah, that's right, 500-page.
Oh, did you read it all?
I've read a lot of the pertinent parts. 500-page legislation called Senate Bill 1, which the governor has signaled he wants to mandatorily veto. We talked to the governor last week, and essentially the difference between his position and the Chicago Democrats' position is a bailout of CPS. But are these distinctions without significant differences? For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by State Senator Jason Barickman. He's a Republican from Champaign. Jason, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me.
The governor is essentially, ostensibly, going to cut and paste the language in your proposal into Senate Bill 1 for his mandatory veto. Could you compare and contrast what you propose versus what Senate Bill 1, the Chicago Democrats' proposal, aims to do?
Sure. Compare and contrast two 500-page bills all in about 30 seconds, right?
We're going to give you 20.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. The fundamental difference here is, there's an agreement on how to distribute money through a school funding formula. The difference being that the Chicago Democrats included a poison pill, really, at the tail end of the negotiations. The poison pill incorporates to school funding the notion that the state will pay for Chicago's normal pension costs, Chicago's health care costs, even Chicago's unfunded pension liabilities are included in their formula. And so what we know is those unfunded liabilities grow, that in effect you're going to have dollars being taken away from school districts to contribute to the financial mess of Chicago's pension system. So, in essence, that's the difference of the two. Now, we have long suggested that we also need to incorporate some mandate relief, the idea that we allow school districts more flexibility in how they spend the dollars that they have. But in essence, the crux of the difference is those two issues: how the Chicago pension system is treated. Some are characterizing this as a bailout of Chicago public schools through school funding, the model that the Democrats have proposed. So we remove that, and we also try to give school districts some mandate relief for flexibility in how they spend their money.
Well, then how are we going to cover the cash shortfalls?
Well, what do you mean, Amy, the cash shortfalls?
Well, I mean,
the budgetary issues?
Yeah, the budgetary issues. Is this money's not going to appear from the sky?
Well, no, we just went through a budget fight where many of us, stood up and certainly communicated the fact that this is another example of the Democrats ramming through an unbalanced budget. They accompanied that unbalanced budget with a tax increase, in that 11th hour. But the reality is this discussion is school funding, and whatever the budget that might be agreed to, the Democrat budget, we of course had our own GOP budget that the governor supported. It needs a formula to distribute the money to schools. And that's been a long argument that we've had for some 3 or 4 years, that the funding formula is unfair, that we're not getting money to the districts who need it the most. And so that's what we're trying to fix here.
Yeah, but Jason, are you not conceding this kind of evidence-based funding pablum that's being advanced in Senate Bill 1, where it has all kinds of mandates from the state on local school districts, as I said at the outset, staffing levels, class size, teacher compensation, per pupil spend. According to the law, schools will now spend $40 per student on gifted programs, $190 per student on instruction materials, $25 per student on testing, $285.50 on computer technology and equipment. It sounds like a lot of micromanagement from the state on school districts.
This is actually one of the misnomers on an evidence-based model. The evidence model does not mandate on any school district how to spend their money. That was a big selling point to me. Now, there's been some mischaracterizations. The suggestions that you've just kind of rattled off are not, in fact, true with how the model works. The model it's kind of like the Stephen Covey notion of you look at what you want the classroom to look like, and you create a funding model that's based on that data, classroom size, staffing levels, et cetera, but you do not, in fact, mandate on a school district that they have to follow those guidelines. So the distribution of state monies is based on data and research. It's the same approach that we took to criminal justice reforms. Instead of basing decisions on political rhetoric and emotional, ideas, instead we distribute money based on data and best practices, but there's no mandates on schools. If schools, once they get their money, and some Republicans don't like this, but once school districts receive their money from the state, the evidence-based model says everything after that is a local decision driven by school boards and the discretion that they have there. And in fact, as Republicans, we've tried to give more local control to school districts so that they have even more flexibility in how they make those choices.
So just to be clear, failure to follow the rules or the best practices under the evidence-based model is not going to result in a district being denied state funding, which is, as I understand, proposed to no longer be allocated per pupil, but rather in exchange for meeting state spending suggestions.
Yeah, no, not at all. There's no mandates, Dan. There's no triggers. There's no negatives if a school district doesn't follow these best practices. Now, we do provide some transparency measures that allow local taxpayers the idea that they can see how money is spent. We also try to empower local taxpayers so that if local taxpayers don't like the way in which dollars are being spent or how much money is being spent, we actually give local taxpayers, the Republican proposal here gives local taxpayers the tools that are necessary for them to get active locally and hopefully bring down their property taxes and bring down their spending to a level that's supported, again, at a local level.
Well, how are you disseminating that information? How are you letting taxpayers know how their tax dollars are being spent?
So by giving, you go back to the evidence-based model hearing, which says, here are the best practices in how dollars are being spent. What we know is that there's many districts, high-tax districts, who are spending money above and beyond what best practices suggest. So what we do is we give that information to voters. Here's what you're spending locally. Here's what best practices are. And then we give voters tools so that they can very easily, through referendum, lower their property taxes if they think they're in a district that's spending more money than they should. Now, that's a decision, that's a debate that I think should be happening locally. I think there will be districts as a result of that who may support spending levels in their area. There's other districts that may decide that they're spending too much money on schools. My point is empower and give to local voters the tools to make these choices and ultimately reduce their property taxes if that's their choice.
I want to talk about the hold harmless provision that's much ballyhooed by the Democrats. We've got to this pot of money. Nobody loses. We've got a new formula that by definition is redistributive, which by definition is some people get more and some people get less. That's what redistribution is. And yet, but there's a hold harmless provision, so nobody will ever lose. Everybody will get at least what they got last year. Well, that's all well and good in the short term, but in the medium term, that depends on a politician's promise to keep coming up with the necessary money to hold harmless schools that would otherwise lose under the redistribution, because that's why they need to be held harmless. So the scam that Democrats are running with this hold harmless provision, pretending that this isn't a play to rob the suburbs, to bail out Chicago, number one, and to buy political support downstate, number two.
Yeah, so I'm with you, Dan. This is a total political decision put forward by Democrats here. think of this. We're in a state, we know we're losing population. We've all talked about that. What accompanies a loss in population is a loss in enrollment. And in fact, if you look at our school districts around the state, school districts in all kinds of areas, whether they be in Chicago and some of the most affluent areas in the suburbs and downstate, are seeing losses in students, losses in enrollment. When the parents leave the state, so do their kids. And so the Democrats, through this hold harmless provision, have said, we're just going to leave aside all of that data, and instead we're going to promise to school district chunks of state money with a promise that you'll never receive less. That doesn't make sense when you consider, what happens in 5 or 10 years to a school district who may have lost 25% of its enrollment. Well, the state of Illinois, through this hold harmless provision, is saying we're going to disregard that data, and we're going to continue to give that school district just as much money in 5 years as we did today, just because we made a political decision to hold them harmless. So it's a horrible policy. It's totally driven by politics, and it actually disregards what the school districts have said. School districts have said, look, if you have to have a hold harmless to get something done politically, which this is, it's a political tool, if you have to have a hold harmless, the school districts have said, do it on a per pupil basis, so that as we gain or lose enrollment, there's an adjustment to that hold harmless. But in fact, the Democrats in their proposal totally disregard what the schools have said and totally disregard the good policy that comes with
of course, because Chicago's hemorrhaging student population, so of course they're opposed to it.
Yeah, Chicago's the biggest loss of student enrollment in the state, but it's not to say that we don't have some of those losses elsewhere too. Some of I believe it's Naperville and some of our other suburban communities has seen significant loss in students. But yes, I think you're right, Dan. The Democrat proposal here is designed to address the losses of Chicago.
All right, so what's going to happen? What's happening today and this week?
So the governor has, this is another one of those unnecessary crises created by the Democrats. So they passed their legislation for school funding reform. It was passed basically on a partisan vote at the end of May. They inserted these poison pills that pick up the Chicago pensions and fix some of those Chicago issues. But even though that happened almost 2 months ago, that the Democrats passed this proposal, this legislation, they've yet to actually transmit the bill to the governor. Now, they haven't done that because the governor said he's going to mandatorily veto some of these poison pills. The Democrats obviously don't want that to happen. And even more so, what they don't want to have happen is after the governor would mandatorily veto the bill comes back to the legislature for action. And we would have an opportunity to then act on the amendments that the governor's proposed. Again, removing some of those special deals for Chicago. Suburban Democrats and downstate Democrats do not want to have to vote on a school funding bill that doesn't include the special provisions for Chicago. So instead of putting themselves in that situation, people like John Cullerton and Mike Madigan have conspired here to say, let's not even send the bill to the governor. Let's just talk about what we want to do in legislation. Let's fail to give the bill to the governor so that he can take the constitutional action that he's allowed as governor. And they're creating this unnecessary crisis, this theater around whether or not schools are going to open this fall. So we're in the middle of that. The governor has said today if they don't send him the bill by noon today, he's going to send legislators back to do a special session, and he's going to do that until we send him a school funding bill, specifically here, Senate Bill 1, so he can mandatorily veto it. Once he takes that action, I think the legislature has an opportunity to pass good bipartisan education funding reform and make sure our schools open this fall.
And part of that, the discussion that's still ongoing, that's part of this ongoing discussion, is about tax credits. Tax credits for that would allow people to voluntarily fund scholarships for low-income children to have the same choice that so many politicians in Illinois have to send their kids to better schools. And I wonder if this is a must-have for you and for Senate Republicans.
So I think this is a great opportunity for us as a state to embrace a program that will give parents and school children around their state some opportunities for an education that some of them don't have. So, yes, I think what you've seen, Dan, is Republicans and Democrats are supporting this scholarship program. It's a program that, again, I think gives some children that may not be in a high-quality public school system an opportunity for other choices. We've been we as Republicans have advanced this idea, but I've been glad to see that some of our Democrat colleagues have come aboard and said, we'll support that as well. I think this is an area where we can take a comprehensive approach to school funding and providing school choice opportunities to our students around the state. So, yes, I'm hopeful that this can be part of a final bipartisan solution that comes together here in a short time.
All right. He is State Senator Jason Barickman, Republican from Champaign. Jason, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.